It's really quite exciting for us to see a school district or the schools in the region take very seriously trying to understand Central America in order to better understand the children who are enrolled in your classes and whose educational experience is so important to their development. And what we're going to do today is say a little bit, drawing from several research projects we have underway at the university and that we've done in recent years, say a little bit about the drivers of migration from Central America. That's really the part that I'm going to do, and then we'll take a break, as Deborah suggested, and then Dennis will share some findings from research we've been doing with children and families in the DC metro area, which is intended to give you a sense, and some of you already will have quite a bit of experience with this, a sense of some of the challenges that young people who have recently migrated from Central America or who are in communities in which extended family and the like have moved more recently. One of the things that I should point out just first of all is the map. We sometimes talk about the northern triangle, as it were, of Central America, the three countries, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, which have been the main senders of people into the United States and into the DC metro area. As Deborah suggested, the DC metro is one of the areas of the largest concentration of Central American populations in the United States, and it is increasingly so. It is distinctive in that while there are some metropolitan areas like Los Angeles where there are actually greater numbers of Central Americans, the DC metro area is the only major metro area in the United States where the largest group of migrants is from Central America. And you can see here that the migration of Central Americans, that the Central American population in the United States is not a new phenomenon. This is a graph that takes it from 1970, where the numbers are very low, but that as you get to 1980, you begin to see an initial wave of migration. I'll say a little bit about this, but to anticipate, it coincides with a period of civil war in the region, particularly in the DC metro area. This is a migration of Salvadorans, but also Guatemalans. After the peace agreements in the early 90s, you see that migration is continuing and accelerating. And that is a function both of the continuing social struggles in the region. Primarily, this has to do with economic conditions, the difficulties emerging from the civil wars. It also has to do with the fact that, as with any other wave of migration, once there's a community that is installed in a particular area, family members, neighbors, and the like follow because they have networks that they can settle with, that can help them to settle in. And so where you have initial clusters of migrants, you're likely to get an accelerating process of communities moving in. And this is what you see then with the very steady increase in the Central American population in the period since. One of the things that is particular to Central American migrants in this relatively long-standing wave, you see the spike in the 90s and around early 2000s. For Salvadorans and Hondurans, also Nicaraguans, but I won't say anything about that because there are very few Nicaraguan migrants here. For Salvadorans and Hondurans, there was a special status granted nearly 20 years ago called Temporary Protected Status, TPS. And essentially, this was intended to benefit people from countries that had experienced serious natural disasters. And I'll say something in a few minutes about the linkage between national disasters and migration from Central America. And the idea was that people could have papers, could have their migration status normalized, and this would be renewed until the countries in question had sufficiently recovered from the natural disaster to be able to accommodate their return. And this had been renewed every year since the 2001 earthquake in El Salvador, since the 1999 Hurricane Mitch, which had devastated Honduras. And what this meant was that migrants from these countries who had been here at the time of those disasters had normal migration status. And one of the first things that the Trump administration did in its overall drive to make America uncomfortable for immigrants was to promise to remove temporary protected status for Salvadorans and Hondurans, which is something that affects many of the households from which your students come. That has been challenged in the courts, as so many of these draconian immigration measures have been challenged in the courts. And at the moment, that termination of temporary protected status has been delayed until early 2020. But this is a strain that is affecting communities across the country, and certainly in the DC metro area. We're talking close to 200,000 people from El Salvador, which of course, that's the people who have the TPS status. You have to add their households to think about how many people are actually affected by this. The numbers from Honduras closer to 60,000. We did a number of studies in recent years about the phenomenon of the unaccompanied children who were migrating from Central America, numbers that had been increasing for a number of years, but that really spiked in 2013, and that have continued at very high levels. The last we measured, and Dennis probably has these numbers better than I do, and you experience it in your classrooms, there have been more than 20,000 unaccompanied minors who've arrived in the DC metro area from the Northern Triangle over the last 5 years. In addition, there's also migration of families with children. These graphs that I'm going to show, these maps that I'm going to show, are just about the unaccompanied children, but I would say that the geography of the migration is very similar for families as well. And typically families encompass women traveling with children, occasionally both parents, but typically women with children. And what you see from this is, first of all, that the migration is generalized across the territories of the three countries. There are, however, where you see those large circles, some particular concentrations, and this has to do with levels of violence, which I'll say something about in a moment. But there are a couple things that are worth noting. Here in Guatemala, for example, this is largely indigenous rural zones, and Deborah referred to climate change. This is very important for understanding the drivers of migration today from Guatemala. But you also see the large circles in places like San Pedro Sula, arguably the most violent place in the hemisphere, Greater San Salvador, Tegucigalpa, and so on. One of the things, though, that I mentioned a second ago is that increasingly in recent years, the migration has become nationwide rather than just from the major cities. And this is from 4 or 5 years ago, and it shows the departments, the regions in El Salvador from which the unaccompanied children are coming. And what you'll see is, while there's 13% in San Salvador, and that's noteworthy because a good third of the population is in San Salvador, you also see important concentrations from San Miguel, from Usulatan, and you see even in quite remote areas, you're seeing migrants coming to the United States. It used to be that it was much more frequent for migration from the countryside to go first to the cities. What we're now seeing is people being driven out from across the country. And that has to do largely with levels of violence, which I will get to in a moment. When we think about the drivers of migration over this period of 30 plus years now, but accelerating in recent years, one way to think about it is in terms of Central America's geography. Keep in mind, first of all, that in the 1980s, this was a battleground for the Cold War. This was a place where the competition for hearts and minds between the United States and the Soviet Union was played out. It's important to remember the Cold War was not played out here in the United States or there in Russia. It was in the Soviet bloc. It was carried out in the developing world. That's where the actual shooting happened, where it wasn't just a Cold War, it was a hot war. And in El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Guatemala, there was extraordinary violence accompanying civil conflicts in the 1980s. And obviously a great deal of American engagement supporting militaries in the cases of Guatemala and El Salvador, supporting the so-called Contra-rebels fighting the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua. If you go back and you look at the human toll, more than 200,000 people were killed in Guatemala during this period, nearly 100,000 in El Salvador, right? So these were devastating conflicts. One of the things that is important about, and particularly this is so in El Salvador, is to think about what the context were for those civil conflicts. It's simplifying a little bit, and this is probably something that will be covered in Dr. Rodriguez's discussion of Central American history, but a sort of stylized, oversimplified version of how Central America was organized prior to these conflicts is that these were largely agrarian societies, focused with the main source of wealth being export agriculture on large plantations. And you had relatively small, in fact minuscule, landowning groups that controlled both land and also the labor living in the countryside. And it had a reserve army of labor that it could bring into the plantations at harvest season, but it controlled the land, and individual peasants had difficulty accessing land for their own subsistence, right? And part of the source of the uprisings in the region was the demand for land, for access to land. And part of what the oligarchy wanted was not to grant access to land so that it would have a force of labor to come onto the plantations and so on and so forth. One of the things that happens with, in Salvador is the paradigmatic case, with the Civil War is that the oligarchy essentially abandons the countryside. It abandons the agrarian basis of the economy. And what it does is move increasingly into the cities. And of course, the war is being fought in the countryside, so that's one of the reasons that it's doing this, but it's also not able any longer to assert its control over the population. As the economy moves away from agriculture and the elites instead live off of services in the cities, right? One of the things that you find is that population also leaves the countryside, increasingly moves to urban areas, but those urban areas aren't able to generate the employment opportunities that would be needed for people to make decent livings. And that's why after the wars you start to see more people migrate for economic reasons. So one issue has to do with this region being infelicitously located in terms of the Cold War, but another has to do with the sequence of natural disasters that have affected Central America for time immemorial. This is an earthquake zone. It is a zone that, particularly with climate change, is experiencing ever more severe weather events, not only hurricanes, but protracted tropical storms that cause incredible flooding, that make people's lands inhabitable, and so on and so forth. It's also important to keep in mind that vulnerable populations and resource-poor populations typically live in housing in communities that are not protected against flooding, natural disasters, and so on and so forth. This is just a list over the past 15 years of some of the most consequential natural disasters facing the region. And I'm always reminded when I look at this of a conversation I had a couple years ago with the, at the time, Minister of Environment in El Salvador, saying we have no capacity to deal with disasters that are inevitable and that are going to cause enormous displacements. This underlines the fact, and there are numerous reasons for this, that there's going to be continuing mass migration from Central America to the United States, including to the DC metro area. So it's particularly important that we understand these expanding segments of our communities and that places like schools and people like educators are better equipped to work with them. I'll go back to this. I want to also point out, this is more the case for Honduras and Guatemala than it is for El Salvador. But another way in which the United States is centrally involved in driving migration from the region is that Central America is a very important corridor for the traffic of narcotics and illicit goods more generally from South America to consumption markets in North America. And this is linked very much to the increases in violence that you can see here in a graph that tracks homicide rates across Central America over the period from 2000 to 2018. And to put this in perspective, what this is the number of homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. And so you see a country like Nicaragua or Costa Rica being relatively low at 7 or 12. Mexico, which we always hear about as being extraordinarily violent, at about 25 homicides per 100,000 people, certainly considered epidemic levels by specialists in public health. Yet, we compare Honduras today at 40, but in 2010 to 2012 closer to 80. El Salvador at 51, but having peaked a couple years ago at 100, at 100, right? These are epidemic levels of violence. These are levels of homicide that one only sees in war zones, right? And so this is driven by a number of factors. Drug trafficking and organized crime is only one of them. I'll say a little bit about some others. But one of the things to keep in mind is that Central American populations, whether they migrated in the 1980s during the time of the wars, or whether they migrated today, are leaving regions, leaving countries that are spaces of extraordinarily high rates of violence. They're also places where the material needs of households and communities are very great. If you look at relatively current figures, so these are 2016 for El Salvador, 2014 for Guatemala, and 2017 for Honduras. The top row is the percentage of people living on $5 a day, and below that of $3 a day. So essentially we're talking about poverty and extreme poverty, to use the kind of World Bank figures. And we have in El Salvador, which has had improvements in poverty rates over the last 10 years, parenthetically, don't have time to get into it, when the former guerrilla party came to power for the first time in Salvadoran history, there was a substantial decline in both poverty and inequality, but still very high levels. A third of the population living on $5.50 a day or less, and 10% living on $3 a day or less. But look at the numbers for Guatemala and Honduras. Half of the population living in poverty, a quarter to a third of the population living in extraordinary difficult material situations. Think about as well, related to this, employment, right? I talked about the old structure of the Central American economies based on export agriculture, right? The key for that model to work was that the population had to be underemployed, so that when there was a need for labor, it was available to be tapped, right? And even as that model has declined in a place like El Salvador, not so much in Guatemala. Even while that's the case, these economies have not generated the employment opportunities needed for households to sustain a reasonable, minimal standard of living. And so we see the underemployment rate, which is the people who don't have sufficient employment in order to sustain their households, at around 30% for El Salvador. This number for Guatemala is clearly wrong, and so we've asterisked it. That's what the Guatemalan government says it is, but it is much closer to the Salvadoran, or I would say actually Honduran rates. In Honduras, 60% of the workforce is underemployed. So if you take 60% of the workforce is underemployed, half of the population is living on $5 a day, and a third is living on $3 a day, you can begin to understand, when you also see homicide rates hitting 100 per 100,000 people, you can begin to understand why a lot of people are migrating from these circumstances. Note also a demographic data about percentage of the population under 25. These are young societies demographically. So around half of the population is under 25 years of age. And so again, think about the violence, think about the underemployment, think about the resource challenges of a young population, and you can begin to construct a picture of migration of young people and young people with children, right? One of the other things that is worth noting here, and it all comes together, is the question of, it's a symptom of these difficulties, is malnutrition. And the percentage of children under 5 who are malnourished. Notice that it's relatively low in El Salvador. It's improved a lot in El Salvador since the government came in 2009. Still substantial. But look at Guatemala, nearly 50% of children under 5 malnourished, and a quarter in Honduras. I'll come back and say some things about the particular features of Guatemalan migration in a few moments, but that number is really worth keeping an eye on. One other factor that is very important in driving migration and in constituting an environment of violence is domestic violence. This is a region where I showed the homicide numbers, but violence is a multifaceted phenomenon, and epidemic levels of violence are evident inside households as well as outside households. So this is simply a summary of the percentage of children who are reporting, who in studies of children arriving in the United States, who report either having been victims of or having been witnesses to domestic violence, abuse, and so on and so forth. Let me step back for a moment and step back from the slides. And Dennis is going to, after we take a break, come back with some slides that are drawn from our research with Central American youth and families and in schools here in the DMV. But I want to add a couple more pieces to this story about the waves of migration, about the processes of migration. Think of Central American migration to the US in terms of waves, right? So I talked about in the 1980s with the civil conflicts, and there's politically driven migration. Again, combined with situations of severe economic hardship. After the wars conclude in the early 90s, nonetheless, you see an increase in migration as a result of economic hardship and the fact that there are now the beginnings of communities of migrants that can help people to settle in subsequent waves. It's beginning in the 2000s where the problems of criminal violence, everyday violence, become especially noteworthy. Now, I mentioned the homicide stats. What I did not go through, and I don't think I have those slides here, are something that all of you hear about a lot, which is the phenomenon of gang violence. And so I want to say a few things about that very quickly. Does anybody know where the gangs, say, for example, the most famous MS-13, where did MS-13 originate? Los Angeles, exactly. This is not a Central American gang, right? This is a Los Angeles gang that goes transnational. And the origins really of the epidemic of gang violence in Central America have to do with the deportation of gang members following prison terms in the United States. Deportation of thousands of criminals by the United States to Central America, often to Central American countries where they really had no connection, right? And where they then set up gangs in the places to which they were deported, right? The problem of gang violence has become endemic across much of the region. It's particularly serious in El Salvador and in Honduras. And one of the things that is most disrupting for people, I showed the homicide statistics, and that's in part a reflection of gang activity, but one of the things that is most disruptive for communities is that the gangs operate largely through extortion, right? The basic model is to control territory. Typically, imagine an urban slum in the surroundings areas around major cities. And you essentially, the gang displaces the state, controls the territory, and taxes the population through extortion, right? La renta. right? La cuota. And displaces the state, provides some degree of order and security, but in exchange for complete obedience from the population. It also reserves the right to recruit youth into the gang as girlfriends of gang members and the like, and does not accept refusals to join the gang, to follow gang directives, to pay extortion, and so on. And a lot of people in that circumstance, lacking any kind of protection from the state, do what they have no choice but to do, which is migrate. This is why we sometimes talk about the right not to migrate. That people lack the right not to migrate in those situations of severe economic need, of vulnerability to violence, and subject to the control of violent gangs. I think that covers most of what I can say in this brief introduction. We'll have time for some discussion and questions. Dennis is going to say some words about what we've found in our research in the DC metro area, as well as in Houston and the Carolinas, studying Central American youth and households, and also their experiences in the educational systems upon arrival in the United States. Thank you.
I'm an attorney in training, and a lot of the work that I do. Sure. A lot of the work that I do at the center is at the intersection of these kids and these families' experiences with the U.S. immigration system. And so a lot of the presentations that I've been doing lately over the years has to do with access to justice, access to the courts, and so it's somewhat refreshing to kind of step back, not to have a group of lawyers to talk to, and to talk to folks that are otherwise engaged with this population. I just wanted to say a couple things. Since climate change, I like to move, and so I'm probably going to be so bad for you. I'm sorry after this. Sure. Okay, it's close to me. So one of I'll just note, since climate change seems to be an interesting topic, Eric showed this slide, and this slide is actually a compendium of all of the natural disasters that the U.S. government itself cited as reasons to continue extending temporary protected status over the years. So you could see that even the U.S. government, across a wide range of different administrations, was still looking and saying, hey, these countries just don't have the capacity to reabsorb these citizens, therefore we need to continue the temporary protected status for that population. So I thought that was interesting. The one other thing that I would say is that, and I'm not going to go more than 15-ish minutes because I want to leave plenty of time for questions. It's better that we end up talking about the things that you guys want to talk about than the things that we want to talk about. But Eric alluded to this, and I think it's important for us to keep in mind that we have a day dedicated to Central America, which is great. But as Eric's presentation already alluded, there's large differences between the subgroups of what we call Central Americans, right? There's Guatemalans, Salvadorans, Hondurans, and these country of origin differences really do play a large role in the integration experiences on the back end. And for an example of that would be the Guatemalan population. Eric was showing you the map of largely, we don't have clear numbers, but a large percentage of Guatemalan migrants coming from the Western Highlands and indigenous communities. That has a huge impact on their abilities to integrate into societies here, communities here in the U.S. and schools, largely because Spanish is their second language. There's 20 plus Mayan languages that are spoken, and one of the things that we hear repeatedly from service providers all around in legal services and school-based services is the need to be able to communicate with these populations. And so, the normal kind of difficulties around integration that we're going to talk about really at a high level, those are exacerbated exponentially when we're talking about Guatemalan migrants who only speak Spanish as a second language. The other distinction, since we're not looking at Central Americans necessarily as a monolithic population, is differences in how they migrated. And you would have gathered this even if you're just a passive consumer of the news. So Eric mentioned a lot of the center's work early on was around unaccompanied migration, and we call them UACs, unaccompanied child migrants. These are kids. I say kids, but they are predominantly adolescent aged, so ages between 12 and 17, who are, when they are apprehended at the US border, are not in the company of their legal guardian. It's not that they're unaccompanied, no one else is with them. No, that's not the case. Usually there's a coyote, a human smuggler, and a group of migrants that they're traveling with, but they're unaccompanied in the sense that there is no legal guardian with them. So I feel like that's an important dynamic that we're going to highlight. A lot of the center's work has been around these unaccompanied populations, but because as we started working on what were the integration challenges, especially in the DC area, we started interviewing kids, and we were interviewing unaccompanied minors. We were also interviewing the sponsors, we call them. Those are typically the parents, but they can be other family members that they're placed with. And we were realizing that actually a lot of the difficulties faced by unaccompanied minors were also the same sort of difficulties that were faced by this other population that has grown dramatically in recent years and now is pretty much dominating the news, which are family units. And as Eric mentioned, these are largely women with much younger children. And so if this is a room full of elementary school teachers and folks and administrators that are engaged with younger populations, I would assume that many of the kids that you're engaging with, and I would invite you to be thinking about the students as we go through these couple slides, that you're engaging with, if they're foreign born and they're recently arrived, they probably migrated through that mechanism with a parent. We don't have time to talk about really the differences, but at least from a legal standpoint, the family units, the children in family units are at a huge disadvantage when it comes to soliciting legal status here in the US. And so it's a very complicated scenario that's going on there. So we have family units, we have unaccompanied kids, and then I would just highlight, and Eric made mention of this too, a lot of young Central Americans who are recently arrived have documented status. Their parents received some form of relief in the 80s or the 90s, and now at this point in the kind of transnational family life cycle is when they have chosen to bring those children here. And we were surprised in the research that we've done is that legal status, you would think that makes life so much easier, but actually from the perspective of the families themselves, it really did little to kind of help with the reunification dynamics that we're going to take a couple minutes looking at. So this is something that we haven't presented on much. We typically do a lot of presentations of the kind that Eric just gave around drivers of migration. I do a lot of work on kind of court outcomes, asylum. So this presentation isn't as polished as our other presentations, so I was thinking, what's the best way to kind of present this data? And Eric already gave you kind of an academic overview, so I'm going to go the other route and say, here are some voices of the people that we've talked to, of Central American migrants, and then kind of use these as a way to think through the experiences that they're having and what those household situations look like. And the first thing that I would say is that, so Eric was giving us kind of a menu of the factors that are pushing folks out of the region. And it's really hard, and you know, this also has legal implications, right? To articulate what is the primary reason that you left, because it's really all of the above. And kids and parents have difficulties articulating that as well. And so I'm just gonna give you, it's really a constellation of factors. And so I would just give you one example. This is a 17-year-old unaccompanied male. He says, I migrated, first of all, to be with my mom, and also because I wanted to continue my studies here and to have a better life. And because there, in El Salvador, I couldn't go out. People would ask me where I was from, and if I said from such and such a place, and they were from the rival gang, they would kill me. So he's articulating 3 different motives for migration, right, in just a simple sentence. One, family reunification, clearly on his mind. To have a better life, this kind of amorphous, I go north to have a better life. And then he's talking about safety. And I would highlight a couple things here. One, this safety, he's saying, so Eric was talking about how gangs exercise control over territory. And so mobility, geographic mobility in these countries is hugely restricted, and there are kind of invisible boundaries between communities where even if you're not affiliated with the gang that dominates where you live, so let's say MS-13 is in control of your barrio, your neighborhood, if you were to cross that line into other gang territory, it doesn't matter if you're a member of MS-13, if you cross into the rival gang's territory, usually Barrio 18, they will kill you because you are seen as affiliated with the gang that you're from. And so that's the dynamic that this young man is mentioning. And so the other thing that I would highlight are two things. He wants to see his mom. Eric gave you this geographic model of, this infelicitous location of Central America as being a principal driver in itself of migration. Another way to think about this, and it doesn't contradict the geographical model, but another factor worth considering is this generational theory, right? If you have a population that's predominantly under 25 years old and they've never met their parents, right? These children, many of them that are migrating, especially the unaccompanied minors who are adolescent age, they have never met their parents or don't remember having met them, right? The parents left when they were 2 or they were 3, and now they're reaching adolescence. And look at the mess of societal factors: violence, lack of educational opportunities, lack of access to the labor markets. And then they say, oh, but wait, I have a mom and she's in DC, right? So what I would stress is that kind of family is a huge pull factor to pull them here, but it usually doesn't happen. Family reunification only becomes a default when these other more immediate concerns come to the fore. Fears of gang violence, lack of educational opportunities, etc. So I would just highlight that. I would also encourage you, a lot of what we hear sometimes from folks that aren't as familiar with Central America is, what kind of parent would send for their child and subject their child to this level of risk in migrating either unaccompanied or with other family members through Mexico to the US? And I would challenge you to think about, and Deborah noted this just before the presentation, of migration as a parenting decision. Right? When these moms largely migrated in the late 90s or early 2000s, they were migrating for largely economic reasons. I would also say that most of the mothers that we interviewed also left because they were suffering domestic violence in their household. But there was large economic incentives to migrate. That was a parenting decision, right? A hard parenting decision to be able to provide for the children that they were leaving behind. And now 12, 13, 14 years later, they're making another parenting decision and saying, this is the time for me to bring my children here. And one thing that I would highlight is that we talked a lot about violence. Another one of the pieces of the puzzle in this generational model of migration is that think about who these kids were left in the care of. They were left in the care of grandparents largely. And these grandparents now are at the point where they can't take care of the adolescents anymore. And so I just illustrated it this way. This is a Honduran mother of a 17-year-old girl and a 13-year-old boy who both migrated unaccompanied 3 years before this interview. The mother says, my mother, that is the grandmother of the kids, told me to either send for them or to come back to Honduras. She couldn't take care of them anymore. She's 75, is suffering from heart disease, and is unable to take care of even herself. So she told me, I can't take care of your children. So I said, if I go to Honduras, I wouldn't be able to give my children a future. What future do they have there? It isn't the same as it is here. Here they have a future. I had a piece of land here, and so I sold it to bring my children here. That's what I did to pay the coyote. That's the human smuggler. And the flights, because I didn't trust anyone other than my mom. I didn't have anyone else that could care for them. If I go, how am I going to be able to care for them there? I'm a single mother. So I would challenge you to start thinking about this migration cycle and choices to bring children here and for families to relocate here as part of a parenting decision where these parents are actually acting in the best interests of their children. This was something that wasn't on the radar as some of the principal as one of the principal needs early on But what we were seeing is that because there were such protracted periods of separation, that family unification quickly came to the fore as one of the most pressing needs of this population. And this happens not only when unaccompanied minors are reunifying with parents, and I would also say that household compositions vary widely. It's estimated that about 60% of unaccompanied minors reunify with parents. The other 40% are either with older siblings, aunts and uncles, grandparents, cousins. So you can imagine what those households are like and that they're very difficult. And so this kind of transitional period of family reunification is one that's fraught with all kinds of difficulties, especially because many of these kids are adolescent aged. Parenting an adolescent is hard enough, much less parenting an adolescent that you haven't seen in 12 or 13 years. And one thing that I just wanted to illustrate through this quote is that we were surprised. One of the things that we did in the interviews that we did with these newcomers was to ask them about some to think about what was their most traumatic experience. We did this at the very end of what was a rather long interview. And so we had gained some rapport with them at this point. And often we would ask them what it was that they were thinking about, because we would ask them a series of questions that they should answer while thinking about what was their most traumatic experience. And surprisingly, despite these kids having narrated some really gruesome acts of violence, these are kids that are living in just this generalized climate of violence where they're always being extorted, where gangs are reality, where shootouts in the streets are common, where their friends being killed because they wouldn't distribute drugs at the school, where these kinds of acts are common. They would narrate those with kind of a lack of sensitivity, but they overall were struck by, and one of the most traumatic experiences that they had over and over again was the separation of from family members in El Salvador or Guatemala or Honduras. And that struck us as really important. And it really complicated their engagement with their families here once they migrated. And so this one is worth reading, I think. This is a 19-year-old high school junior from El Salvador who migrated unaccompanied 3 years prior to the interview. He said, "I left El Salvador on my birthday without saying goodbye to my mom. What hurts me most is that I fought with her the day before. I yelled at her because I was hungry and because we never had enough food. And she got very angry with me for screaming at her so nastily. She always, despite being poor, always had something for me, and sometimes I didn't even realize it. The day I left, she told me, 'Look what I have in the drawer,' and she showed me some new clothes and a pair of shoes. I didn't even notice that she had bought them. I felt so bad," and this is where he breaks down crying, "and now I can't tell her in person to forgive me for what I said to her that time." And this is a 19-year-old boy who's breaking down in an interview because he still can't get over the separation from his mom that happened 3 years previously. And I feel like these snippets don't even give you the fullest sense of kind of the dynamics. This kid came and then reunited with his dad. They lived in an apartment that was shared with 3 other families. So his dad and he shared a room. And it was funny talking to this kid. This kid came from one of the most impoverished areas of El Salvador, and just talking to him about what he saw as the principal challenges that he faced in integrating into school and integrating into life in the U.S. And at one point in the interview, he tells this story about how he and his 2 siblings and his mom in El Salvador lived in a 1-room house. There was 1 bed that they all shared. And so cleaning the house only consisted of making that 1 bed and his mother sweeping the floor. And then he came to the U.S. and had more things, and there was more space, even though they were in a cramped apartment, and he had more responsibilities. And he felt at one point that he couldn't function because he didn't know how to arrange all of the things that he had too many pairs of shoes, and that to line them up was kind of too much for him to do. And I would invite you, a lot of the kids that you have in your classroom are facing these same kinds of difficulties in adjusting to the environment around them. I have more, but I think that since we have 15 minutes, do you want to stop? Sure. Just to kind of illustrate the dynamics of family unification, one of the questions that we asked the sponsors, because we interviewed both the kids and we interviewed the parents that were taking care of them, or if it was an aunt or an uncle. And one of the questions that we would ask, and we were careful how we asked it, was what level of communication that they had had with these children previously, and whether they thought that they really, kind of on the backside now, really knew their child or their relative. And some of their responses are interesting. The mom of an 8th grader, the mom and dad, this is one of the few instances where the boy migrated to reunify with biological parents who were both here in the US, though they had migrated at different times. He migrated unaccompanied when he was only 10 years old. This is the dad. He says, not very well. We had an image in our minds of what we thought he was like from our conversations and from what our family told us. But when he came here, it was completely different. He knew we were his parents, but it wasn't like the love between a parent and a child because he didn't know us. But as time passed, he began to treat us differently. He understood that we were his parents. And then a Salvadoran mother whose daughter migrated unaccompanied at the age of 14. Well, I was with her only until she was 2. After that, I only saw her by video chat. But it's not the same as having seen her here in person. I didn't know her deep down. I'm still getting to know her. I'm trying to get along with her, but I realize we haven't been together for 12 years. And part of the research that we did was we were fortunate enough to be able to participate in some focus groups that were being hosted. I don't know if this audience is aware, but Fairfax County Public Schools now has a family reunification program funded by FCPS that provides 6 weeks of workshops for sponsors to go through that help them think through parenting strategies, because this was identified as such a difficult topic. On the one hand, these parents are ashamed to ask for advice, right? Here they are with adolescents that they've never parented, at least in the sense of parenting in the same household. And so there's a sense of shame for having to ask how to parent or for not knowing how to parent. There's guilt and abandonment, and the adolescents typically exploit that, right? They're the first ones to throw in their sponsors' face sometimes that they were abandoned, right? And sometimes there's a lack of knowledge on the part of the youth of why the sponsor, the parent, migrated in the first place. And so to kind of give a space where sponsors and their kids can kind of work out these difficulties and have some guidance from licensed mental health workers. There's these workshops. Also, they're happening in Prince George's County Public Schools, La Clínica del Pueblo, that's a DC-based nonprofit. They are now engaged in a couple high schools in Prince George's County where they're doing the same thing. And we had the privilege of kind of going in and sitting through these workshops and watching these parents work through these huge difficulties, and just some anecdotes of these parents trying to treat their adolescents as if they were the age that they left them, right? And trying to give them gifts that they weren't able to give them that were appropriate for a 4 or 5-year-old, and the adolescent looking and saying, this is just further proof that my mom or my dad doesn't know me, right? They don't know that I've grown up. They don't know who I've become. And so if you can imagine kind of negotiating those hard transitions in households, and we don't have time to go into the detail, but the prevalence of household disruption, of adolescents then leaving the household because those reunification scenarios aren't working, is endemic, to the point where folks at Montgomery County told us that their number one problem were unaccompanied youth squatting in abandoned apartment buildings, and that they were starting a pilot project to address that need. And I know that the Latin American Youth Center in DC is kind of facing a similar situation. So, folks in this room, if you have elementary students, and perhaps they aren't foreign-born, they might be U.S. citizens, I would bet so many times we would go to these households, interview an unaccompanied minor, and there were 3 citizen children in that household, right? The dynamics between stepchildren and in these mixed status families are fraught in all kinds of ways. And the more that you can kind of understand what these families are struggling with is important. I'll do one other thing, because I think this is an important point, and then I'm done, and then we can ask questions. Fear of deportation. Much of this data was collected before the Trump administration. This quote comes from before the Trump administration, so I can only imagine what parents would say now. But this kind of fear of deportation, this deportability we call it, permeates every aspect of their lives. And it doesn't matter if the student in your classroom is documented or not. There is such fear because someone in that household is undocumented. And though the unaccompanied minor might already be in legal proceedings, someone else in that household is scared about getting deported. And we even saw, parents even told us that fear of deportation influenced how they counseled their children to respond to bullying in school, right? These are things that parents are thinking about constantly. And I'll end with this quote. This is a mother of a 15-year-old unaccompanied Honduran, and she says, "I'm illegal, and so is my husband. I've never been so worried about losing my children as I have been this year. There have been moments, days, when I can't even sleep. One day I was working in a restaurant and some police officers came in. They weren't ICE officers, they were sheriffs. And I started panicking because that was when they were doing the raids. And oh my God, I was crying and had a horrible headache. The officers just came to eat. But I was nervous and upset the entire day because I don't know what I'd do if they came and took me away from my children. If they came and said, look, leave and take your children, I'd leave without a problem. But to come and take me and leave my children here is inhumane. Sometimes I think about all the people who've been deported and had to leave their children behind, and I think, what pain must that mother be suffering? It's terrible." I would end just not on a sad note. One of the recurring things that we found in our studies of kind of older aged, adolescent aged youth was that one of the principal sources of resilience were mentorships in the school space. We had huge success stories. I'm good friends with this kid that I interviewed. He was 18. He graduated from Northwestern High School in Prince George's County because an ROTC counselor took an interest in him. He then won scholarships to go to PG Community College, where he's at now. He'll soon be transferring to the University of Maryland, fully scholarshiped. There's these kinds of success stories, and I remember interviewing the kid, and I had said, could you imagine 5 years ago that this would be your experience here in the US? And he looked at me and he goes, I didn't imagine this 3 months ago, right? And so it's a testament to the role that educators play in these students' lives. He had been placed with an aunt and uncle who rented out a room in their house for him. He was responsible for making his own food, for paying for his own food, for working a job, and for paying his aunt and uncle rent, right? And so these are hard situations. And so thank you for giving me the time to talk about it.
So we have, I think, about 10 minutes for questions or reflections, comments. And if you could say your name as you ask a question, we can pass around the mic for both of our speakers here. Anyone have any questions or reflections, comments you'd like to share? Yep, back here.
So I've taught this population for years. Oh, my name is Katie Whelan. I'm from T.C. Williams High School. I work in the International Academy, but I've also worked in Central Virginia and in the West Coast in San Francisco. And I love that you're saying this because this is exactly every year the same issues and what you were saying about what happens in their country and the violence and even the detention centers. I never hear about that. I hear about the family, and it's an ongoing issue. And additionally, their parents, it occurred to me how they are also went through the same things. So it's like second-generation refugee issues because their parents themselves, went through the same violence and they come here. So there's major communication and trauma issues in multiple generations.
But I just jotted down a few things that I wanted to ask about. It sounded like one thing that you were saying is that sometimes it's better for the unaccompanied kid, that the unaccompanied kid has more resources and it's better off than unaccompanied. And I just wondered if you could say more about that, if that was true. And then also, in Guatemala, you said that they speak different languages, so Spanish is their second language, which means if they come here, English is their third language. We always say we send stuff home in Spanish, but our kids are illiterate in Spanish. Well, I mean, that just talk a little bit more about that too.
Hello. I got a green light. I misspoke if I said that the unaccompanied minors are better off. They're worse off in the whole kind of range of social services, except for the legal services. There are special protections afforded them in terms of how they can solicit asylum if they're unaccompanied. So they tend to have greater avenues to legal access. But I think that we would agree that in terms of kind of navigating family reunification dynamics, it's much more difficult. Yes, the second language, I would also say, so of course all of our interviews were done in Spanish. There was a team of researchers. I had a really good friend. She had studied psychology at AU. She was Honduran herself. She was the one that kind of facilitated much of the communication. We were struck by the number, and of course we had consent forms not to be signed, right, but just kind of information about the project to share. And we were struck by how many times that was just, the parents themselves were illiterate in Spanish. And so there's just layers and layers of difficulty of even, the translation just doesn't even help you.
Can I just add one? I would add, let me just grab this mic for a second. From an instructional perspective, when we think about in elementary school teaching about indigenous peoples, and we often teach about the indigenous peoples of the United States, there's also one way to make a connection with Central America is to look at Guatemala and all the indigenous people and the various language groups and the incredible work to preserve that language. It's also been the group that's been most threatened when the U.S. was attacking villages. Literally numbers of entire language groups were lost. And so a focus on language, the power of language, the importance of maintaining language, the history both in the United States and in Latin America around language is a powerful thing to explore. And so certainly when we're looking at it, we can share more resources as a follow-up to make connections there.
And I just wanted to make one comment. I appreciate the recognition of intergenerational trauma. That's something that I feel like is super understudied in academia. One other thing that we found across, I interviewed about 30 people from different public school systems and NGOs that are engaged in school-based programming, and secondary trauma from you folks, experienced by you folks who have to hear a lot of these stories day in and day out is something that we heard about a lot, and that school systems really need to start thinking about ways and resources to kind of help teachers and other admins have to face those challenges.
Just also go back to the slide about where youth are coming from, and where I mentioned the Guatemala City, but this is the Western Highlands, largely indigenous, right? So not all of the Guatemalan migrants will be Spanish as a second language. And keep in mind, Spanish as a second language doesn't necessarily mean really Spanish as a second language. There may not be Spanish skills, right? It may be strictly indigenous language. And the other thing I want to point out here is remember the Guatemalan data. Overall in Guatemala, 46% of children under the age of 5 showing physical consequences of malnutrition. That's overall. If you looked at the Guatemalans coming from this region, it would be virtually universal, right? So that non-Spanish speaking population from these areas is dealing with a lot of different cumulative challenges.
Hi, I'm Abby, and my question is, this is probably really hard to predict, but in terms of ICE raids, we see them happening across the nation. In Northern Virginia, do we anticipate
country or globally, one of our families was raided by ICE over the summer. They took the parents away. They only left one person behind because someone had to watch the children, and we'll get to the specifics if you have these children, but it was a very traumatic experience. So, can you have any information about when it's happening? No. It was funny that we had heard about that was going to happen, and then after the news had said it really didn't happen, only a certain percentage. Well, they were, one of them was here, and I'm like, okay, that's weird. But anyway, go ahead.
Dennis may have greater sense than I do about how this plays out with schools and whether schools are vulnerable to being the focus of raids and the like. One thing I would say, though, separate entirely from the research that we've been talking about here, there are colleagues at AU who've been administering a survey, the DC area survey they call it, and so it's the entire metropolitan area. They have several thousand respondents, and they're trying to get a handle on whether people feel at home in their communities and what they like about their communities, what worries them in their communities. And we've oversampled for neighborhoods in the DC metro area that are disproportionately Latino. And one of the things that is just remarkable is that universal across the community, fear of deportation is of themselves or a loved one is just off the charts. It's virtually universal. And if you ask people, you know, have you been impacted in the last week by, by fear? What might that have been? Deportation. It is absolutely a source of extraordinary anxiety at the individual, but also then community level.
I would just add that it seems like the ICE raids, and this is somewhat anecdotal, but it seems like ICE lately has been targeting sanctuary jurisdictions, whether they're specifically designated or designating themselves as sanctuary jurisdictions or not. So that's kind of unnerving, right? That these raids are kind of being used as a retaliation measure against local governments that are seen as welcoming these populations.
What do you mean? Are you saying that so now ICE is kind of hanging out?
So the initial reporting when there was a bunch of raids where the thought process into which localities they were focused on was the jurisdictions that were de facto sanctuary jurisdictions, and that had to do with whether they were honoring detainers for people that were placed into custody. I think Fairfax County, just the new sheriff a couple years back, canceled the agreement with ICE, and so that would make Northern Virginia kind of ground zero. But there's a lot of jurisdictions like that in the DMV.
And what about this task, the status that people are here on because they came as, what was it?
TPS.
TPS.
Yeah.
Would we expect that some of our families are still on that, and is there the thought that once we no longer do TPS, or do they have to go back?
That's a good question. Eric and I were just talking about this the other day because there seems to be fundamental misunderstandings even in the region in El Salvador itself as to what would happen with these populations. So the Trump administration canceled the TPS designations in 2019. They were extended through the beginning of 2020 only by court injunction. So that's the only thing that's keeping these avenues, these legal statuses alive. Folks have renewed, although I have heard that the renewal rates were decreased, right? That all eligible people to renew their TPS status didn't do it because of the whole kind of discourse around fear, exactly. So they at least have it until 2020. Whether they'll have it after that, I can't tell you. The litigation is pretty crazy.
If they don't have it, do they have to go back?
So we're talking about what, 250,000 Central Americans. The likelihood, yes, I think if they're picked up, right? If they're picked up as a part of other kinds of, and then exactly. But there's no resources to kind of affirmatively go out and round up 250,000 people. So, it's nice they'll stay here, but then there's all kinds of repercussions for their families. Many of them have jobs that require immigration status, so they might lose those jobs. That will decrease the level of remittances that are being sent back to countries of origin because that income stream is not there, and that just increases the number of people in the household that are deportable. Major concerns.
just on this, one piece of the answer though is yes. The DC metro area there are many TPS recipients in the metro area. So this is enormously disruptive in those communities. And legally, they would no longer be authorized to be in the country. Practically, when we speak with people anecdotally, they tell us, we're not going back. Right? They'll figure some other kind of arrangement, try to prolong the process and so on. But it adds to levels of uncertainty in those households and in those communities and for the kids.
Can we have one more question and then we're going to take a break before we start our breakout sessions at 10? Roach J. Just yell.
Okay. Hi, Marguerite. I feel like I've been in Alexandria for over 20 years at this point, and I've seen the landscape of our school system really change. And I really believe this summer was an experience that I shared with a colleague of mine of dealing with students during an enrichment summer program where we were accosted on a regular basis. And they were from these regions, and they had these mentalities that were just very gangster kind of related type of attitudes. And I felt like I'm an immigrant as well, but I'm from Canada, so it's a little different. But I wanted to know, with this awareness that you're bringing to us, what is the expectation? Because I feel like what I've had to use this summer was my ability to de-escalate situations in a very diplomatic and equitable kind of way, where they weren't going to feel like I was against them, but that I was more with them. So with this awareness, what do you want us as educators to know? And what kind of resources are there for these families who are living in this kind of fear?
Those are great questions. I don't know if I can answer.
I think that's actually an important segue into the workshops, because what we've heard this morning reminds us of the stress that people are under, the stress that we know impacts people's health, their ability to learn, the decisions they make in their lives. No one is born being a gang member. Nobody is born deciding to be violent. No one is born saying the first thing I want to do is leave my homeland and leave my grandparents behind. Those are all things that these conditions have forced on young people and families. And so I think the hope is with this session to start looking at what are the factors that have created these conditions, and then thinking about what we can do in schools. In elementary school, the sessions we're going to look at are going to be sessions where you can think about how to even bring stories of the region into the classroom. We know that oftentimes part of the thing is having an opportunity to talk about it, to put it on the table. Most often the history and the experiences of Central Americans have been absolutely absent from the curriculum. They're certainly absent from children's books. It's absent in the mainstream media. When we hear about people coming, we don't really ever hear about the fact that really their first desire would be to stay home. The hardest thing, if you can imagine, for these young people who've been raised by their grandparents, they actually thought they were abandoned by their parents, so it's their grandparents who've raised them. They're now having to leave their grandparents behind at the very age where the grandparents need them. So the level of guilt, the level of stress, and then the forced participation in gangs, all of these things, and then to have your own reality be invisible in the schools. And so what we're going to move into is to look at what are ways to make the region, the history, the migration experience visible, to put that on the table, and also to help compare that, as we said earlier, to experiences here in the United States, in the history of African Americans, of Native Americans, that there are many parallels in this history that can also provide a lens and that can help students feel a sense of solidarity rather than also a sense of animosity. So I think if that's okay, I would like to just, another round of applause and appreciation